We like to think that the people who raised us are incapable of treating us like strangers. But family isn't always a shelter. Sometimes it's a transaction you didn't know you'd signed. And the cruelest part isn't the betrayal itself, it's the moment you realize it had been happening for years, quietly, in plain sight, and you'd been calling it love. The envelope was sitting on my childhood kitchen table like it had always belonged there. It was a Thursday in late October. I remember that specifically because the trees along the lake had just begun to turn, that particular shade of amber that always made the house feel warmer than it actually was. I'd driven 4 hours to have dinner with my parents. I wasn't asked. I just came, the way I always did, because that's what you do when you've spent your entire adult life trying to be the kind of child your parents could be proud of. The kitchen smelled like it always did, cedar and something faintly chemical, the wood polish my mother used on the floors every Sunday without fail. The overhead light was off. Just the range hood light, casting that dim, yellowish glow over the countertops. My mother was at the stove. My father was sitting at the table, his hands folded, not reading anything, not watching anything. Just sitting. That should have told me something. The envelope was plain white, letter-sized. My full legal name was typed on the front. Not handwritten. Typed and printed. There was no return address. But I recognized the slight indentation of a notary seal pressed into the bottom corner. I picked it up. My mother didn't turn around. "You should sit down first," my father said. I sat down. Inside was a legal document, 4 pages, dense text, official formatting. I'm not a lawyer, but I'd seen enough documents in my professional life to understand what I was reading, even as some part of my brain refused to process it. It was a formal declaration of disinheritance. My parents had removed me, their only child, from their estate entirely. The lake house, the investment accounts, everything. Transferred to a family trust that listed my father's brother, my uncle Gerald, as the sole beneficiary. The document was dated 6 weeks prior. 6 weeks. I sat there in that dim kitchen, holding 4 pages that had been sitting in a notary's office for 6 weeks, and I said the only thing a person can say in that moment. "What is this?" My mother finally turned around. Her face was composed in a way that told me she'd rehearsed this. "We felt it was time to make our wishes clear," she said. My father looked at the table. "We didn't want there to be confusion later." That was it. That was the explanation. I drove home that night in complete silence. I didn't cry. I didn't call anyone. I just drove, watching the white lines of the highway disappear under my headlights, thinking about the specific texture of that moment. My mother's rehearsed composure, my father's avoidance, the cedar smell of a house I would apparently never inherit. Over the next few weeks, I tried to understand what had happened. Not emotionally. I'd learned a long time ago not to perform my feelings for people who had stopped being interested in them. I mean practically. Legally. What had actually been done, and why? What I pieced together, slowly, was this. My parents had been struggling financially for about 3 years. The lake house, a property worth somewhere north of $1.2 million, had a second mortgage on it that none of us children had known about. There were no children, plural. Just me. And I hadn't known. My uncle Gerald, my father's older brother, had lent them money twice. Significant amounts. And somewhere in the process of those loans and those conversations, a quiet agreement had been reached that if anything happened, Gerald would be repaid through the estate. What I couldn't understand, what I still spent nights turning over, was why the solution had been to cut me out rather than simply tell me what was happening. I had a career. I had savings. I had, at that point, a net worth that was modest but real. I could have helped. I would have helped. But they hadn't asked. They had simply rearranged the paperwork around me and placed an envelope on the kitchen table. I hired an estate attorney. Her name was Patricia, and she had the kind of stillness that made you feel like she had heard everything at least twice. She reviewed the documents, asked me methodical questions, and then leaned back in her chair and said, very calmly, "This is legal. But there are some things here worth looking at more closely." She flagged the timeline. The document had been drafted and notarized 6 weeks before I was given it, but I'd spoken to both my parents in the interim. Twice to my mother on the phone. Once to my father, a long Sunday call about nothing in particular. Neither of them had mentioned it. That's not illegal, Patricia said. But it's useful information. She also noted something about the family trust structure that didn't sit quite right, something about the way Gerald's name appeared in relation to a property management clause. She wanted more time to look at it. I told her to take all the time she needed. 7 months passed. I didn't reach out to my parents. They didn't reach out to me. I'm not sure what I expected, some kind of follow-up, some explanation that would make the shape of the thing make sense. But there was just silence. The kind of silence that has its own texture, its own specific weight. I went about my life. I worked. I saved money. I stopped driving past the highway exit that led to the lake. The call came on a Tuesday morning in May. My father's number on the screen. I stood in my kitchen for a moment, watching the phone vibrate against the countertop, making that faint buzzing sound against the marble. Then I answered. "Hi, Dad." A pause. Then, "We need to talk." He explained, in the carefully managed tone of someone who has been practicing, that the lake house was in trouble. The second mortgage had ballooned. There were penalties, fees, deferred interest that had compounded into something much larger than the original amount. They were looking at foreclosure. The property needed to be either refinanced or sold, and if it was sold under these conditions, there would be very little left after the debt was settled. He said he and my mother had been talking. He said they were wondering if I might be in a position to help. The number he said, so casually, so carefully, was $300,000. I wrote it on the notepad I keep by the stove. Not because I needed to remember it. Just to see it in my own handwriting. To make it real. "I see," I said. "We know things have been complicated," he said. "But you're still our daughter. And the house has so many memories for all of us." I thought about the envelope on the kitchen table. The cedar smell. The notary seal. The 6 weeks of phone calls about nothing in particular. "Let me think about it," I said. I called Patricia that afternoon. What she had found, in those 7 months of looking, was worth considerably more than anything I'd been asked to provide. The family trust my parents had set up, the one that named Gerald as sole beneficiary, had a specific clause embedded in the property management section. It gave Gerald the authority to act as manager of the lake house property during my parents' lifetimes, with compensatory rights for management services rendered. Gerald had been billing the trust for those services. Monthly invoices. Modest amounts, individually, $400 here, $600 there. But over 3 years, those invoices totaled a little over $62,000. Money that had been pulled from my parents' accounts to pay a man who was also receiving the estate. My parents didn't know. Or if they knew, they hadn't understood what they were looking at. There was more. The second mortgage, the one threatening foreclosure, had been arranged through a lending company where Gerald had a financial relationship. Not ownership, not exactly, but a referral arrangement. The terms of the mortgage were not favorable. They were, Patricia said with a very particular kind of quiet, the kind of terms you'd only accept if someone you trusted told you they were normal. Gerald had told them they were normal. I sat with that for a long time. My parents had cut me out of their estate to protect a man who had been quietly extracting money from them for 3 years. And then, when the consequences of his arrangement arrived at their door in the form of a foreclosure notice, they had called me. Not to explain. Not to apologize. To ask for $300,000. Patricia said we had options. She wasn't using the word fraud yet, but she was circling it. There were regulatory bodies she could contact. There were civil remedies. There was also the matter of the trust document itself, which she believed had been signed under conditions that might be worth revisiting with the right kind of scrutiny. She asked me what I wanted to do. I called my father back 2 days later. I told him I wasn't going to provide the $300,000. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I hope you understand what that means for the house." "I do," I said. "It's been in the family for 30 years, he said. There was something in his voice that might have been grief. I think it probably was. "Your grandmother spent summers there." "I know," I said. I have the photographs. Another silence. Then, is there any chance you'd reconsider? No, I said. But I want you to look very carefully at the invoices Gerald has been filing against the trust. I want you to ask him to show you the documentation. And then I want you to call an attorney who has no connection to Gerald or anyone he's recommended. A long pause. What are you saying? I'm saying that someone has been taking from you, I said. And I think, somewhere in the last few years, you convinced yourself that cutting me out of the picture was the safest thing for the family. And I understand why you thought that, even if I'll never fully understand how you got there. But the person you were protecting wasn't me. It was Gerald. I didn't say this with anger. I want to be clear about that. I said it the way you say something that has been true for a long time and simply needed to be spoken out loud. My father didn't respond for almost 20 seconds. I counted them. Then he said, very quietly, I'll call an attorney. The lake house was sold 8 months later. Not under the foreclosure conditions my parents had feared. Once an attorney examined the trust and the mortgage arrangement, there were enough irregularities to renegotiate the terms. Gerald quietly disappeared from the picture. I don't know the details of what happened between them. I didn't ask. My parents didn't apologize, not in any direct way. What happened instead was that my mother called me in February, the following year, and asked if I wanted to have dinner. She mentioned a restaurant we'd been to when I was in high school, one I'd always liked. We went. We talked about ordinary things. At the end of the meal, she looked at me across the table and said, "You were right to say no." That was it. For words over cleared dinner plates, in the kind of restaurant lighting that makes everyone look a little tired. I nodded. I paid for my half. Some things don't get resolved, exactly. They just find a new shape, quieter, a little sadder, more honest than they used to be. The lake house is someone else's memory now. The photographs I have are enough. And I've learned, in the most expensive way possible, that love without accountability isn't love. It's a transaction with your name left off the paperwork. I hope you never have to learn that. But if you already have, I see you. And you were right to protect yourself.